Hello, everyone. It's time for a brand new episode of The Witching Hour. And this is a special one because I'm here. Haleigh's here.
Hello.
But somebody else is also here.
Hello.
Dorina.
Buenas tardes.
I am so happy that you're joining us for an episode. And you dressed for the occasion,
I did.
of course.
I did. I had to. I've had this really old Suspiria shirt forever because the original is one of my favorite movies. So my favorite horror movies and favorite movies. So there you go. I had to.
Excellent choice.
So thank you so much for having me and inviting me. I've been wanting to do this with you guys forever. I'm like, I don't care about the other Collider shows. This one's my favorite.
We wanted to have you on here too.
Long in the
I hope you
works.
leave the movie talk door open though, because I'd like to get you on that at some point.
No, I do enjoy all the Collider shows, but this is, as you know, horror fans. Come on, you're my girls.
So the reason we have you in today, the reason you're wearing that shirt today is because the Suspiria remake is going to be available on
Amazon Prime.
Do you know when? Do you have the exact date?
Let me look that up.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
but
nice deflection there, Perri.
In my mind, Haleigh knows everything and anything Suspiria slash witchy dance movies.
You are all about to experience a lot of the note-taking and thinking I've done on Suspiria, but somehow in all that research, looking up the release date was not one of those things I did.
It's sometime soon, and we've been talking about this ever since the movie was first released, is that when this time came, we wanted to do a full-blown spoiler review, and you were always on the table to be part of that. So that is basically what we're going to bring to you this episode.
This will be available on Amazon when this airs.
Great.
Because it goes live on Prime on May 3rd.
Perfect.
Nice.
So you should all have seen Suspiria by then, but just in case you haven't, fair warning, the beginning of this episode, the large majority of this episode actually, is going to be full-blown Suspiria spoilers, so you have been warned. We are going to dig into that in just a minute, but at the end of the episode, if you want to scroll ahead, scrub ahead, however you're doing it, there is going to be a bit of a conversation about our favorite witch movies out there, so that is the non-spoiler material. It will be at the end of this episode. Right now, though, your very last spoiler warning. This is it. We are diving into it. Haleigh, take it away.
Okay, so Suspiria. Oh my God, Dorina and I were like teeing this up ahead of time. There is so much to break down.
So much.
But since, they already kind of know our general thoughts on it, like they know I'm super obsessed with it. It was my favorite movie last year. And they know Perri's more in the middle and positive, but not obsessed with it.
Yes.
And what are your general thoughts?
I don't have time to be obsessed with it. But if I did, I would be. I loved it. I am like I said, I'm a huge fan of the original. I was wary when it was coming out. And then I heard the creative team behind it, Luca, who I'm a huge fan of this director and the actors and the cast. So I just went in thinking, you know what? Hopefully it's different enough than the original that they'll do something cool and unique and make me like it. And the entire movie, I was just drooling. Like my horror nerdness was like, I was oozing and I was so happy. I just loved
oozing.
it.
I was going to say,
So
I
happy.
love your choice of words right now.
but that's what happened, though. I was so surprised at how much I enjoyed this movie, and I think it's because it's so different than the original.
Enjoy is probably not the word that I would use. And all right, so here's what happened. You know that after I first saw it, I walked out of that exact screening like a little shook, a little uncomfortable, a little not convinced that I really liked it or needed that in my life. And when it started to sink in, I started to really appreciate the craftsmanship behind the movie and the performances and a whole bunch of the themes, all that good stuff. And I was determined to rewatch it. But that was right around the time that Oscar season was kicking up, and I didn't have time. Then this episode of the podcast rolls around, and it's time for me to rewatch it. And if I'm being completely honest, it was a challenge to get myself to push play. I really didn't want to.
You had only seen it the one time?
I had seen it the one time. I started to play it, and it made me feel up until, the contortionist scene, the scene where she's ripped apart in the dance in the mirror room. Up until that point, I'm like, no, I didn't really need this in my life again. And then all of a sudden it got past that. And it's not to say I didn't like that scene. I'm wowed to no end by how they pulled that off. Yeah. But it was when all the stuff really started to settle in after that I started to think to myself, oh, this is what was getting at me after I was able to digest it fully the first time around. And I walked away pretty glad I gave it another go.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's,
You can stay in our witch coven.
Yes, thank you. I'm so happy I'm welcome. It really is just, excuse my language, it's such a mind fuck of a movie when, something like this isn't super suited to my taste, but it's like I can appreciate it, but I find it off-putting, and I kind of like that back and forth and that not knowing exactly where I land on something. It kind of creates an unusually exciting atmosphere when I'm watching something that I don't really get very often.
That you're uncomfortable, but you want to keep watching.
Exactly.
And that's good art.
Fascinating to me.
And that is, it is so very much like what they're trying to tap into, I think, with this film. It's inherently, as you've just expressed, an incredibly challenging movie.
Yes.
And sort of what I think we're going to do here is maybe break down some of the elements that help I don't think you can explain Suspiria, but do our best to help it more easily understandable and digestible, because there's so much to take in. And one of those elements is certainly what you're kind of speaking to, is the uncanny, this uncomfortable feeling that you can't quite put your finger on, that makes you uncomfortable in your own skin, but also perplexes your thought and draws you in while it's repelling you. So I want to talk about first, since it came up first, the uncanny, and that is particularly relevant during those dream sequences, which I think are a huge highlight of the film. And so before we...
Sorry, I'm going to start sighing the original Goblin score. I'm just do
it. It's the mother of sighs. Sigh away.
It's like the uncanny plus the mesmerizing.
Yes.
Like there's like a hypnotic quality about all that stuff, too.
Absolutely. I want to read this... this quote from Freud's writing on the uncanny, which I think is particularly interesting and relevant. It's kind of a summation of what it means. The subject of the uncanny is a province of this kind. It undoubtedly belongs to all that is terrible, to all that arouses dread and creeping horror. It is certain, too, that the word is not always used in a clearly definable sense, so that it tends to coincide with whatever excites dread. And this is what Luca was going for in those sequences in particular. And I'm curious, what do you get out of those dream sequences? What do you take from them?
It's interesting because we have sort of a similar thing going on in the original one, where I think and I don't mean to compare it to the original one, but I think it's necessary to say that the original one to me is just a gorgeous, visually stunning work of art, filmmaking art. That's why I love it so much, the way it looks. Whereas I think this version of Suspiria, the story itself is much richer and deeper, and that's why it's much more complex, and that's why we're here talking about it so much. And those dream sequences themselves, not only are they shocking and uncomfortable, like we're talking about, but I think they add actually also to the story a lot. It's a combination of Tilda Swinton's character, one of her many characters, Madame Blanc, trying to mess with Susie and these other witches, and then that's where Luca, the director's kind of telling the audience, well, actually, Susie is kind of taking control, right? Because we don't know until the end of he's kind of telling us and revealing that she's going to end up being, the mother of sighs, right? Suspiriorum, right? Mother Suspiriorum. I don't even know how to say it. I'm just going to say it in Spanish. Suspiriorum.
There you go. And sounds better anyway.
And so it's interesting how we're so shocked and uncomfortable watching them that we're not paying attention to the fact that they're telling us, oh, she's actually, fighting back with her own magic, and she's kind of learning that she may have some form of control of her own power as well, So that's what I saw. At least the second time I saw it, right? The first time I was like, what is this? I was just so shocked because it was so cool looking, and I was scared, and I loved it.
The second time around made me wish that I could have experienced the other characters having those dreams also, and seeing how they reacted a little more specifically. Poor Olga. Not to derail this, but my heart broke for her the first time because of the mirror scene, but when you watch, I wish I had looked up that actress's name, when you watch her performance for every single moment she's on screen, it is freaking heartbreaking. You could see that the life has just been kind of sucked out of her, and it's really heartbreaking, but it's nice to come back around and see it a second time and understand exactly what Susie's doing, because that completely reshapes her entire journey. And it is fascinating how the first time around, every single time I could see the wheels turning in her head. It's like the first time I'm basically looking at you as, oh, like you're a naive girl who just wants to dance from Ohio. And then the second time, it's actually someone coming to realize who she really is and what she's really capable of.
Yeah. You might even call her a final girl in a different way.
Yeah.
Right? Where
a warped version of a final girl.
Yeah, because the horror trope that we have usually is a final girl overcoming the horrors of being, persecuted or trying to beat this villain or obstacle. And then all of a sudden it's like, in this case, she actually finds her own power, right? So she remains to be the final girl because she found out who she was.
I also love how it's not so cut and dried. I don't want to get too far ahead of your schedule here, but also when you watch how she reacts to everything at the end, because it would be nice and simple and easy to basically say, oh, she was naive and didn't really know what she was capable of before, and this is her journey of seizing her power, but it's also her kind of, or at least this is how I read the end scene, her understanding what her power is and choosing how to wield it. And I appreciated that the ending has that incorporated in it. Otherwise, not to say that I would have been able to say I've seen something like this before, but I think it makes her a much richer character that they take that extra step beyond it.
Well, that I think is a perfect transition because actually I think the intention of wielding power is like the sort of the through line of the whole film. And for me, like the process of at least glimpsing an understanding of this film started with trying to understand the history of when it's set. And this movie is about people who abuse power, how generational struggles come from that. It's about the youth getting angry at their forebears for ruining the world they live in. And
I'm sure we can all relate to that currently. Yes,
exactly. And I think that was very, intentional on behalf of Luca and the writer David Kajanek. I think I always say it wrong.
Yeah.
I love that dudes make this super feminist movie, by the way.
I know. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's, he has said very plainly he wanted to tap into 77 Germany, particularly because it is such a recent memory of fascism and the fallout from fascism.
Right.
And so...
And that's because I'm not a historical buff like other people. So can you explain, just like give a little bit of summary as to like what was going on? Like, as far as I understand it, it was the Red Army faction, right? Where there's a violent, extreme leftist group causing violence in order to get rid of like the last few Nazis, right? Like that's the way I understood it. Is that correct?
Yeah. Like this is also not. I am a history nerd, but this is definitely not what I studied in history. So this is through like limited research. Not like I got a doctorate in this subject or anything. Just to be clear. Okay. But yeah, so like that time in 1977 was called the German Autumn, and it's this sort of culmination of the after effects of World War II in Germany and Nazis and this post-World War II era where the Red Army faction was really, that I think was at their height. It's right at the end of their bombings and their radical leftist violence. But it is this conflict between the two generations and the aftermath of one realm of fascism, and then moving into, I think the question of the film becomes the many forms that fascism can take, and that none of these people are innocent or particularly, fighting a good fight. Like the Red Army believed, the RAF believed in what they were doing, and maybe you might in your head align with their politics more, but they were terrorists, you know?
Right.
Speaking to Susie's power at the end of the film, that's a fascinating moment. Is she solving anything?
Right.
Or is she a new form of fascism?
Right.
She takes away his memory. She does not give him a choice. Is that the utopian version of fascism? Like these themes are very much tied in. The film is set in just, God forgive me, I don't know how to say the city name, but it is the city that is right by the Berlin Wall, which is obviously this huge reminder of that previous era. So that is sort of the overarching question throughout the whole film.
Well, that's why I think the writer, David, did such a brilliant job of correlating, what was going on politically at the time with the ballet coven. right?
Yes.
Because the witches themselves, like you can see that most of the time, or if not all the time, they're trying to protect themselves, right? Regardless of all the bad things they do, regardless of like they're just, I mean, granted they look like they're having a lot of fun and I'm like, maybe I could join, but they're horrible people, you know, but they do look like they have some fun.
They do.
But they're obviously responsible for hurting humans, right? And they don't care at what cost. And all they just have the one goal together of bringing, you know, Helena Marcos back, I guess. But it's an interesting correlation to see this group of humans that don't care about the consequences of their actions, and in fact they're just trying to protect themselves constantly, which is what happens in war.
Yes.
You know.
I mean, they're also facing factions within the coven. They're going through their own revolutionary cycle. And, you know, Helena Marcos being the most obvious allegory for fascism within that coven. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they're just trying to protect themselves. And that leads us kind of to Klemperer, the doctor, who is this figure. He's the witness. He's the witness for the coven. He was also a witness in World War II. He watched everything happen. He didn't stop it. He didn't get his wife out. And he lost his wife. He lost everything. He was just trying to protect himself, just trying to protect his lifestyle. But it cost him everything he loved. And I would like to read this little quote from David from when I interviewed him on Klemperer. Said, he doesn't factor in how complicit he was in her disappearance. He doesn't factor in how he was complicit in standing by and letting an entire nation come apart in terms of its dedication to human values. So we knew that he was going to be a part of the story and that he was going to help us articulate to an audience what it meant to stand by and let evil things happen. And that's so relevant.
Yeah,
that's so
always.
disturbing. The first time around, I had a difficult time feeling the flow from one part of the narrative to the other, and I was so. I mean, actually, this kind of speaks to that too, and you know. Your taste and your reaction to terrible things happening in movies, especially as horror lovers like we are in this room. It was very difficult for me to want to be with Dr. Klemperer because I found the coven stuff so intoxicating, and that was all I cared about. And I was so swept up in their journey that every time I was sucked out of it and I was dealing with the political ramifications of what's going on in the real world, I'm like, I don't want that. I want to go back there. But when you watch it again and you see how well woven those narratives are and how one enhances the other so well, and when you tap into what you just read, that's almost like how my mind was functioning, is I was okay ignoring all the outside real stuff because I was so taken away by what was happening inside the dance school, and that is effed up.
Very interesting self-reflection, Perri.
It's problematic.
You just blew your own mind.
I blew my own mind / upset myself, but it's fine. I'll get over it.
We all know you're a good person.
Yeah.
It's okay.
That's why Haleigh and I aren't hexing you right now.
Yes, exactly.
I wouldn't know how to stop it anyway.
No, you're probably one of those maybe she's the Robin Tooney of the group, and she's the one that's gonna stop us, Haleigh. No, I'm kidding.
Does that make
Who knows what's going on up here right now? No, it's either like it's discovering your power in a good way or in a bad way, like Susie. Like I could be like the Susie of Collider, and eventually I'll rise up. I don't know.
It's like, look at my vagina-looking chest. I love that, by the way.
That was amazing.
That third act is so fucked up, and it will never stop being that way. I mean, that's the other thing about this movie that really stuck out to me the second time around is how, one, either things will be more impactful, but also how having known that certain horrific visuals were coming my way, like that didn't stop the effect of it. Like still, a second time over, I'm watching that third act and I'm like, how did they make this happen? How did some producer and some financer out there give him the money to do that?
Yes.
I would highly encourage anyone who loves this movie to go read interviews with the below the line crew and learn like how much went into creating those rooms, to building that whole academy from scratch.
Incredible.
It was an abandoned building and they made it gorgeous that way.
Wow.
the final chamber, like the walls are made of hair, and you don't even realize that until you read these interviews with the production designer or the cinematographer or the choreographer. It's fascinating, the artistry that went into every single element of this. Everybody talks about how much they talked with Luca about reference points, be it art or film. Fassbender was a huge reference point as a German filmmaker from that era. Like, they went all in. Yes. And I don't know how they got the money, to your point, but thank goodness they did.
It's just like, I wonder what like the pitch was for something like that. Even to get these below the line people involved and some of these stars involved, it's like you have to hit the point in the script, like for Dakota Johnson, for example, where it's like, oh, then your chest splits open and everybody does like naked dancing and you're just in the middle of it. You cool with that?
Right. Well, and it's interesting because I don't know if you guys remember, but that last scene, everything's in red, and it's just gorgeous. Like when they use colors like that in movies, I mean, that's why I love, one of the reasons why I love Mandy from last year, right? Like anything where there's all this color correction going on, but it actually, in order to help the story, that's why the original Suspiria works so well, So it's also, to me, it was a beautiful, effed up final scene that very different than the original, but still paid tribute to how artistic the original was. You know what I mean? Like that's why I'm so thankful to this team and Luca, because I think they did that so well. They did their own version while still paying tribute, right? This isn't a direct remake at all.
Right, no,
not at that's all. Why it's so good. But going back to we're talking about the correlations of the war and the story of the Coven. It's crazy that on a first watch, and a lot of people I've talked to that didn't really get this movie, like, to me, it's every generation, every group, whether it's a government, a society, they're usually looking to absolve themselves of any culpability that they have of their effect on society, right? And the witches here are doing that. The people outside of the ballet studio are doing that, right? Like, it's showing us that, like, you have power within you, whether you're a witch or just a human, and you're gonna have to decide whether you use that power, in the Spider-Man way or not. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So. It's I love the ending as well. God, I love everything about it. I'm like spinning in my head, but just. The use of multiple actors I find really fascinating, and I guess this kind of leads into another element that helps understanding it, which is that it's very much based on psychoanalysis, and you can read a lot about this if you're so inclined on Birth Movies Death. Britt Hayes did an incredible breakdown of the three characters that Tilda Swinton plays. So in the end, we see her as all three of them. She's supposed to be the id in Helena Marcos, the ego in Madame Blanc, and the super ego in Klemperer.
Yes,
my brain. And we also see that, though, like this idea of shadow selves or these psychoanalytic things. The woman who plays Death, the death that comes up out of the chamber,
so cool,
is the same actress that plays Susie's mother.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Huh. So there's all this interesting double play with the
now
performers.
That you say that, I think there's like a back-to-back shot, like a flash in that moment, right? Where it's like the actual death in the third scene, and then it cuts to a quick shot of her mother.
I believe you're right.
Huh.
That makes that. Well, that's what's interesting too as you rewatch it too. I mean, there's all of these. There's so many scenes that are just edited quickly together that you miss things, right? This is like the most in-your-face, subtle storytelling, we've seen in recent horror movies, right? Because you do see, like, even just this lady holding a book, like a Bible or whatever, next to the mother, right? Like, there's all these different scenes that people might just be like, well, why are we seeing that? That's boring. I'm like, no, like, I don't think Luca put these scenes for no reason there, right? So you could probably break down everything that's on there and just get more clues.
Is this bad to say? I would like a Suspiria prequel and know how that mother knew that she brought a sin into this world. because
Yeah.
of what she
It's
says about
fascinating.
Susie. It's like she
Yeah.
always knew that like Susie
She was evil.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I think that you're right when this is a story of self-discovery. I don't think that Susie knows what she is at the beginning.
I don't think so
she,
either.
she
Until
knows-
she gets to the
She feels
the
that
coven.
pull
Yeah.
to go
Right.
there, that pull to Madame Blanc and to go to Berlin.
It speaks to Dakota Johnson's performance too,
Yeah.
because it's
Right.
like never for a second, even on the second viewing when I knew where her path was heading, did I ever think, oh, Susie's trying to like pull one over on them. Like, no, she really believed who she was at the very beginning, and her friendship with Sarah was super pure, and she basically just makes that transition.
No, and I'm glad you said that because the first time I saw it, my first instinct was to think, oh, Dakota was the weakest part of the film. But then on the second rewatch, and when I knew what was going on, like I was able to see when she was finding out her power. Even though there's that. I think the scene is funny. Men might think it's terrifying when the
funny.
witches are fucking with the policemen, and you see Susie spying on them, and most people would be like, oh, that's fucked up, but she actually kind of starts laughing
Yeah, it's
and
one of my
enjoying
favorite
it,
moments.
right? And so that's where you kind of think, okay, this girl's different, right? She's not the original like Jessica Harper that we saw, So that she's not an innocent. In this, and that's why it's a different final girl.
Can I ask you a question? I'm curious to get your take on this. Also, just for the record, the character Olga was played by Elena Fokina, who I thought was phenomenal. in the
She's
movie.
amazing.
Question. I'm still obsessed with Miss Tanner. She's just always the one in every single scene that catches my eye. Why do you think she was left alive at the end,
I was
even though she
wondering
was
that.
the only one who voted Marcos and was not killed?
Yeah,
That's a good
I
question.
haven't cracked that, honestly. I'm not sure.
I'm not quite sure either.
Well, was Susie deciding who would die and go? Because remember she was asking Patricia and Sarah, the other girls, like,
asked the
what do you want to do?
victims.
And they said they wanted to die, but she wasn't. Was she herself deciding to kill the other witches,
It was
or was that?
the way it was presented was that everyone who voted Marcos got like
Head
Right.
explosion.
gut blasted.
Yeah.
Right.
That's another. I mean, that's the parts of this that are harder to explain than like. It's about fascism and human relationships
Yeah.
and motherhood. That's easier on a thematic level, but like trying to even explain what is that figure of death? Is she at her beck and command, or is she doing some sort of will
Right.
of another power? There's also two other mothers that would have been built out in second films.
Yeah.
The way that I look at it right now is that I think that she was one of the only ones kept alive because it's basically a depiction of a new regime taking over with Susie as its leader and the non-Marcos voters in power, or basically making up the coven and the dance company at this point. And they keep Miss Tanner because even in reality, when you see a regime change, it's not like, I mean, you could even go back to the Nazis. Not every single person actually went on trial or was wiped out. They're still in the mix, and I think that that's what she represents, is the old mind will always still be there. And who knows, maybe in decades to come, she'll teach what she knew to somebody else, and then it'll flip-flop again.
Yeah.
I think you're
that's
dead
when,
on.
And that's when life becomes history repeats itself, right? That's when things become cyclical. But that's I don't know if you read this, Haleigh, but I read it. I think it was an interview by Jamie Rigetti from IndieWire, and she interviewed David, the writer, and he said that he actually researched. Not just the historical aspects of the war going on in Germany at that time, but just witchcraft in general, and how what he wanted to do is kind of show, why society has always been afraid of female empowerment. And which is why they used to burn witches back in the day, right? And so looking at that, he kind of, I guess, correlated that to the creational power of a woman's body. And at the end of the day, like we talk about gender relationships and how women can be afraid of men, but at the end of the day, men are very afraid of women as well, and that's why they've always kind of, called us witches, brujas, whatever witches, bitches, And so it's also interesting to think about, like, I was scared of these women throughout the movie, right? Like they were like, usually you see a witch that looks messed up and is in a costume, but these just look like normal people, and they were terrifying.
Yeah.
And so like nobody could mess with them. And I thought that part was really cool to for this man to write this story about, two policemen being embarrassed with their bodies because that's what dudes are afraid of, right? Whereas like women are afraid to be whatever, like killed by men, but at the end of the day, they're so powerful as well, right? We're the ones that actually give birth. I'm not going to, but we're the ones that are supposed to do that, right? So at the end of the day, it's just going into that, like female empowerment while also creating life. Like that's, I don't know. I thought that all that stuff was really cool. So
it's
sorry, I like went off on a tangent because so much to think about.
There is so much. I know. It is a fascinating element, and motherhood is obviously such a huge part of this movie. I mean, I think Luca put it really summarily. He said that this is a movie. It's a horror. This movie, it's about the horror of interpersonal relationships, about the horror in femininity, and about the horror in history. And like that motherhood is a big part of that horror of femininity. And I think you're so right. You're like, we're afraid of violence and men are afraid of being laughed at. I didn't even put that together in that scene that they're all cackling in his face and dinkling his.
It's like their worst nightmare. And a dude wrote that scene because that's what how he feels, right? Like that as a man, that's his fear, right? That's like being embarrassed in front of women. Yeah. Right?
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I do want to bounce back to what you said really quick because I think it was really smart, and I think you're right.
Gold star for me.
And that Miss Tanner was kept alive as this like, you can't kill everybody who does wrong or your infrastructure completely crumbles. But the demands of a societal infrastructure also demand that relics of the past that are haunting you will always be there. And thank you for helping me put that into perspective.
I was thinking about that a lot
I like
today.
that a lot.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially because, sometimes you just, like, or, the great power of, the three witches together maybe decided this is a person that we need to keep alive for now.
Right.
For whatever purpose that person must serve in order to, accomplish what we want to accomplish in the future. But then can you control that, right? Like because it's still a live being and you can't control everything around you. So it's fascinating.
And so like back to what you were saying about motherhood, that's an interesting question when it comes to Madame Blanc and Susie. Who's playing mother and who's playing daughter at various points in that film. And I'm curious how you guys chart that journey in your head and maybe where you see the switch, or if there ever is one, or are they both playing both roles?
So do you think that they're, at the beginning, Blanc thinks that she's going to have power over her?
Yeah.
And then eventually, because you see that they did a really good job, both actresses, of being fascinated with each other.
Yeah.
Like I love that scene. Like, what does Susie say? Where she's like, it felt like what it feels like to fuck. Yeah, I think
a man. I was thinking an animal.
Yeah.
And her delivery too. It's almost like kind of deadpan.
Yeah.
It's so good. But there's also this interesting, speaking of motherhood, there's this weird thing that Blanc is kind of predatory towards her and is fascinated by her but wants to control her at the same time. And it's interesting as to like how society wants to control how the birth, right?
Yeah.
Because society always wants to control how we're raised, and so that's another kind of interesting correlation, right?
Yeah.
With like movies, this movie towards like society. But yeah, so maybe that's my thought. I think that eventually she realizes that she can't.
Yeah,
at the end.
It's a fascinating journey that she feels so maternal to this figure who ultimately becomes the mother that she worships.
I'd be curious to watch it a third time with this in mind, where I'm specifically looking at Blanc the entire time and how she's reacting to everything. Because even on the second go around, I think I didn't see that switch until the very end in the final chamber when, that to me was the first time we see any kind of like apprehension, like something doesn't feel right now. I don't think
she has a little before that. She has her scene with Tanner where she's like, we will not rush this again.
Well,
we can't do it unless she accepts it.
And when she's developing the new dance, I think that's a little bit of a maybe her losing her footing a little bit.
The scene that did it more for me was when they're all in that restaurant bar and they're looking at each other.
That's a good call.
I feel like that's where they were kind of both realizing, okay, we're up against each other.
I wonder if that scene, like her original intention, like, because you see that it's like a mix of students and a mix of teachers, and they're basically all like they're hypnotizing the students.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's what was meant to happen, not even necessarily across the table, because in that moment, Susie makes the choice. She's sitting on the side booth at first, and then she makes the choice to sit at the other head. I wonder if whatever teacher was over there was meant to look at her and put her in a similar state, so she walks into that chamber just ready to follow the rules, and that doesn't quite happen.
When I talked to Dakota for this, she said that there's a moment she decided on where she thinks that Susie fully understands and accepts her journey and her role in this. I would bet it's that table scene, but she wouldn't say. She said she wants us to decide for ourselves. But I would put money on the table.
Or maybe even when she was getting dressed for that too, because like you could see, she looks entirely different. She looks like she fits in with one of the teachers.
That costume in that scene, especially when she comes back and she starts dropping it off.
I feel like you want that.
I want it so bad. Of course
should we do it for
The
Halloween?
second she started getting dressed for dinner, I'm like, Haleigh needs that dress.
Yes, I do. I need everything in this movie.
And all
for
I
like
got,
a Cold War.
I was going to say, all I got was
fascism.
one of those like spiky rib things. Speaking of which, how did I not bring it in the room for this?
Oh, I know.
It's
It's
still
still sitting on my hook, but I
That's
couldn't
just like
find
a casual thing I keep on my desk.
I know.
now.
You showed it to me, and I was like, this is something that if I was at Perri's house, I would definitely steal and then tell her later when it was at my house.
You know what? The thing is, I would be so understanding of that. I would get it.
Because it's so good. It's my favorite.
And it's so you.
By the way, not to go off on a tangent, but are we going to talk about the music at all? Because you guys know I'm a score nerd.
Yeah.
It is so beautiful.
Dude, I love Goblin. Like, I was like, okay, the movie might be good, but there's no way the score is going to be, which is not. Goblin is still like, they are Baroque prog rock, it was perfect for the original Suspiria, but I'm very pleased with what Tom came up with. Like I'm more of a Johnny Greenwood fan for his scores, but I'm actually, it's really impressive that he came up with very sad music that's beautiful at the same time, as well as liberating, right? Like it's interesting to hear. It's like he's adding to that end scene where everything's red and bloody, but it's very sweet piano.
It is,
and it still fits because you're kind of shocked and horrified by the scene, but at the same time you're also rooting for the characters because you care about them. Like there's not any character that I was like, I want bad things to happen to this character throughout like the whole movie. Like as much as they were doing horrible things, I still rooted for them.
Well, it helps reflect the reality of seeing a new regime take over too, where it's like all that weight is lifted and you're kind of happy, but there's something still a little uncertain and in this case sinister about it. But you needed that hopeful quality at the ending too, because one of the most touching moments of that whole sequence is when she releases the other three. Like she lets them like rest, go to sleep, whatever they need after all this suffering.
Yeah. I hesitate to describe her as too benevolent because I do think that a lot of the thematics is that she's yet another dictator kind of ultimately. But it is a beautiful moment. And that score, I was so lucky. I got invited to an event before I ever saw the movie where they played.
Go to this.
Yeah, they played the whole score for us, and we just sat there and listened to it like it was a. They even, I never saw this at any event before. They had little edible strips before it started that you could take. Yeah.
Damn, my kind of people, man.
I know, it was amazing.
I can't believe that's a thing that happened,
Yeah.
but
It
I
was
can
wild.
believe it because I guess why not now?
It's California, baby.
Yeah.
And it was perfect way to take it in. And it was so
Wow.
fascinating to listen to the emotional journey of it before I had seen what the film had in store.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I usually, I'm such a soundtrack nut, as you guys know, that it's really hard for me when I'm looking forward to a movie to not listen to the soundtrack before it comes out. And I'm like I did it for Blade Runner 2049. I was like, I could wait, but I can't. I was just like a little kid and I cheated and I had to listen to it. So I listened to it before it and I was like, God, this is gorgeous. I loved it so much. And then when I saw the movie, I was surprised by how well it fit. Yeah, it was great.
It's beautiful. And it's really understated, which is interesting because in a lot of films, in a lot of ways, this film is so very extra.
Yeah.
That the music is so elegant and sort of low key.
But then that song called when they do the dance, it's called Volk.
Yeah.
It's so different. It's not piano, you know. It was such a cool, creepy, like kind of like rhythmic, perfect song for this ritualistic dance. Like I loved it.
I hate that we're running out of time. We haven't even
know.
talked about Volk and it as the
I couldn't even bear there to
symbol
tell
of,
you
like,
that we are under
I'm aware of the time.
I know.
But I will just say it's a fascinating symbol of what these witches who survived that Nazi era created this sort of spell as an empowerment of themselves, and then to see this new girl come in and struggle with it and really want to put her own mark on it and keep trying to change it. But Madame Blanc is resistant to the change that she was originally trying to institute with that dance. It's a fascinating symbol.
Yes. Yes, we could talk about this for days.
I know. This should have been a 2-part episode.
I was going to say, I mean, I don't know. Why not in the future?
Yeah.
Especially if he ever gets to, I don't know what the realistic nature of the plans for another film are, if it's, ever even possible, but I don't know.
I'll certainly be doing spells for it, but I doubt it.
Yes.
I mean, actually, a good reason to revisit this could be maybe doing some sort of. I love how I'm making these promises now, and I'm going to be eating my words eventually. But like an Argento episode, or even like an episode for the original Suspiria, that
absolutely,
yes,
examining
always
the
happy.
ties, the similarities, the changes. I don't know.
I have the Blu-ray 4K restoration, so we gotta watch that.
Which I
love
want to
it.
see.
Yes, it's
me
gorgeous. It's one of the most gorgeous movies. It's so good.
All right, we are about out of time though, so since we promised a few witch recommendations, I feel that we should deliver them before we get kicked the heck out of here.
How do we want to do this? Do we want to go one at a time?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, you're the coven leader, so I say you go first.
Oh, you really know what to say to me.
You're like bruja número uno.
You guys, can we not leave? So, obviously, Suspiria, both versions.
Yes.
Duh.
Yes.
The Love Witch is a huge passion of mine.
Thank you.
Yes. Haxan is an old, essential, silent, black and white, creepy-ass satanic witch situation that you definitely should watch. The Witch, amazing. I'm actually a defender of Lords of Salem. I think that's a really cool, weird witch movie. I think the first half hour is better than any other part of that movie, but I also think it does some cool, really weird witchy stuff. And then, like a sweeter one, Practical Magic is a really lovely witch movie.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I will second Practical Magic because that was one of those movies that I grew up watching over and over and over and like wanting to be like those sisters, especially with a sister of my own. And similarly, I also grew up watching The Craft, which we've already had name dropped. I watched that on repeat. And so curious to see if that remake ever finally happens. I don't know
You
what's
hear
going
whispers
on with that.
of it, but I don't know if it's happening.
I think
right?
it was something that like got a little bit of a go ahead and then stalled for a while or something. And I think it's still in that no update zone territory. But The Craft, I have to say, Hocus Pocus.
Yes.
Hocus Pocus is like almost what started it all for me. When I say I was obsessed with The Craft and Practical Magic, Hocus Pocus is on another freaking level. That was my first Doug Jones encounter, and I fell in love with him after that. Like,
Billy.
so many childhood crushes in that movie, and still to this day, whenever it's on, it lights up my freaking life.
Yes,
I adore that
absolutely.
movie. I also have to give a big shout out to the Blair Witch Project because you guys know I am mildly obsessed also with found footage or shaky cam type films, and that one was just groundbreaking in so many ways. And still to this day, even though I've seen it so many times over, when I, in particular, not even watching it on the big screen, but when it's got that like on my iPad where the room like melts away and I get so sucked into it, it still to this day puts me on edge. Some of that imagery and the sound is so unsettling. So I give that movie so much credit. And freaking witches, Wizard of Oz, it's a classic. Yeah.
So a couple of the ones you said, obviously.
What have we left you with?
So no. So before Hocus Pocus for me, there was The Witches.
Yes.
With Angelica Houston.
Terrifying.
The Roald Dahl book, and which is maybe now if you see it, it's not as scary. But as a kid, these witches are literally just destroying children.
That was the movie that wrecked me as a kid.
Super messed up, And Angelica Houston is fabulous. She has this weird accent, and then she takes off her mask, and it's hideous. Like the makeup was so cool. That was a really cool movie for me. And then obviously grew up with Hocus Pocus, and I just love these three women having fun, and I just never identify with the character so much as Sarah. I love her. She's my favorite. And I'm glad you brought up The Love Witch because that's a movie that not a lot of people know about, and I think it's just just a amazing accomplishment by this woman, Anna Biller, because you guys know she did everything for it, right? You know, she directed, composed the score, production designer, costume designer. Like, it is incredible.
I know.
And it makes you feel like you're watching a movie from the 60s, and it's like, and she did it on purpose where it's a really cheesy story, and it's kind of almost like there's porn acting involved, you know, like it's bad in the sense where it's like this feels like a B movie from the 60s or 70s, but at the same time there's all this really smart, interesting analysis of gender roles. And whether it's, you know, like they're not even saying it's a feminist movie. It's like, no, this girl's crazy and these guys around her are crazy too. You know, I loved it.
It's a really heightened film, like all of like the performing, the construction of everything, but it's also, I think people miss how freaking funny it is.
Yes,
it's
so funny,
deadly funny and clever film.
Yes,
this is like off topic. I feel like it's only a matter of time before we wind up with like a newfound witch craze.
Oh,
because
we're
a lot of the movie, are we really? Because a lot of the
it.
movies that we're naming are either, you know, a little bit older, or they're like Love Witch, or even Suspiria for that matter, where it's under the radar, not necessarily widely appreciated. I'm just saying, I think that a witch movie is going to hit, maybe not at it levels, but somewhere close to that, where it starts like a major craze, or like A Quiet Place, you know, like that kind of craze.
And I wonder
reinvigoration.
I wonder if you know, because we got The Witch as well, which is the opposite of The Love Witch, right? It's not a funny movie. It's a super depressing movie that's hard for me to watch, except for the ending. Like, I wanted the ending to be the whole movie. I was like, now we get to party with Black Phillip. Like, come on, let's see this.
I do like the taste of butter.
I do want to live deliciously. Like, because if I showed up, I have this horrible life with a horrible family, I'd immediately get naked and be like, let's do it. I totally get it. So maybe that's the one that started it. It just also wasn't as commercially successful, unfortunately, right? But so maybe it was vampires a few years ago, and now we're living the witch time, which is very exciting.
I really do think that like witches need to, I mean, I don't want to reduce it to this, but follow in the footsteps, blockbuster-wise, of, let's say, vampires or zombies. There's so much to explore, and we could wind up with like really rich character studies, kind of like Suspiria on the big screen. It's just, I think it's just more so about the fact that a lot of the witch movies we've gotten are more challenging. And that doesn't make them any less worthy of a wide audience, but the second you do that and you have something with, let's say, a darker ending, you're completely narrowing your viewership.
Right.
So unless you make the sad truth of the industry.
So maybe there's always Witches of Eastwick, you know, because that one's that's one just more so funny than scary.
That's true.
But does Drag Me to Hell count?
Yeah.
Drag Me to Hell does count.
Because that's a great movie.
Yeah,
and isn't
that
movie. Celebrating an anniversary right about now?
Oh, God.
Jesus,
Probably.
we're so old.
I know.
Isn't it 10 years? It's 10 years, isn't it?
Shut up.
Sorry.
I don't like to think about that.
Another sad truth in this world.
House of the Devil just had 10 years, and I was like,
how is that
possible?
You know, that was one of my very first junkets ever at the Crosby Hotel in New York. I will never forget it. Greta Gerwig and Ty West, and I was like on freaking cloud 9. I will tell you, I was sitting at that table, and I'm like, look at where I am right now.
That's really cool.
So I think this is it.
That's it.
We're about to get kicked out of the booth.
Yeah.
It's time. I'm sad. It's time. But
let's
just
what? Hex them.
You have the answer to everything, don't you?
And it's always hexing.
The bright side of this having to come to a close in such a way is that, like, we need to get you back on the show ASAP. So this just gives us even more motivation to bring you back very soon.
No,
Dorina.
thank you so much for having me, ladies. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I love horror. I love you guys, and always happy to talk about it.
Where can everybody find you on the internet in between now and your next Witching Hour appearance?
I am at Evil Dorina on Twitter, on Instagram, not on Facebook. Facebook sucks.
Yep.
And I have my own channel called Super Dork House. You can catch me on the Talks at Google channel, interviewing celebrities as well, and on other Collider shows like Collider Live.
Haleigh?
I'm not as impressive, but you can find me on Twitter at Haleigh Fouch. You can find me on Instagram at Haystack McGroovy, and you can find me on Collider.com.
And she's very impressive because her articles are amazing. You guys should read them.
I second that. You guys can catch me on Twitter and Instagram at PNamroff. As always, I have to remind you, please like and share us everywhere. Comment and rate, whether it's in podcast form on the Collider Podcast YouTube channel. Tell everybody you know about the Witching Hour, because clearly everybody needs more witches and horror in their life right now. Thank you so much for watching and listening. You have officially survived the Witching Hour.